Hello, everybody. How's it going? We're going to wrap up World War II today. So yesterday, we were talking about the end of the war in Europe, and we talked about the Yalta Conference. And the goal of the Yalta Conference in 1942 was to decide, where to end the war first. Do we end the war? This was the Allied powers meeting, so this was Churchill. This was Roosevelt, this was Stalin, all coming together and deciding that they were going to take out Hitler first. They saw him as the bigger threat, and then to focus on Japan. So yesterday we talked about those final movements. We talked about how the attacking through Italy, taking out Mussolini, the British and the American troops, then taking back France in 1944, Battle of D-Day, the storming the beaches of Normandy, one of the highest casualties of the war for us in that single day. And then finally the Battle of the Bulge in December 1944, and then really from that point forward, just squeezing in from the south. Italy at that point, once Mussolini was done, just like World War I, flip sides, okay, that loosey-goosey friend. France, Britain, US coming in from the west, the Soviet Union coming in from the east, closing in. Hitler commits suicide in April 1945, and then the war is over in Europe. So VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, May 7th, 1945. Now that part of the war is over. For most of Europe, they feel like the war is over, but particularly for the U.S., the war wasn't over. In fact, we really hadn't gotten our revenge, so to speak, right? If we had had a choice, we would have taken out Japan first. And of course, because that was personal for us. Japan had attacked us. They had Pearl Harbor. And so for the U.S., the going along and taking out Hitler first was really because we were outnumbered. If we had had a choice, we would have taken out Japan first because it was personal for us. We had been attacked. And I think that's a pretty natural feeling to have. So while we agreed at the Yalta Conference to aid and assist, which we did greatly in the war in Europe and to help end that war first, we also, though, put most of our Navy, so we sent troops and Air Force to Europe, but we sent most of our Navy, what was left of the Pacific Fleet, and then what we had of our Atlantic Fleet to the Pacific, and quickly started to rebuild our Pacific Fleet because we were not going to just let Japan sit by for the next 3 years till we wrap things up, okay? So while we were, I want you to hear me clearly, while we put a good chunk of our resources in Europe, okay, we did reserve some of our resources, particularly what was left of our Navy resources, to at least temporarily, start picking away at the war in the Pacific, okay, particularly with Japan. So what did the war in the Pacific look like? Well, basically after Pearl Harbor, Japan, there was really no obstacle for them. And so they are going to sweep through Southeast Asia very quickly in the course of about 6 months by summer. So they attacked us in December 1941. By June 1942, they were getting ready to attack Australia. So they had moved all the way through. If you look at that map, they had moved all the way through Southeast Asia, Indonesia, one of the last obstacles, and we're getting really close to Australia and New Zealand, which of course were Allied powers, extensions of Britain, who had gained their independence. So rightfully so, they're freaking out, going like, oh my gosh, help us, because they're not prepared to defeat the Japanese. But everybody else in Europe is preoccupied. Britain's kind of like, sorry, man, we can't send a friend right now because we're kind of busy. We've kind of been destroyed and we're trying to take on the bigger beast, or at least what they saw was the bigger threat, that was Hitler. So for them, the timing couldn't have been better. The U.S. is going to arrive in the summer of 1942 in Australia to help in collection with the Australian New Zealand forces to start pushing back the Japanese, or at least stopping them, okay? And this is going to be the first time that we see the Japanese have some kind of offensive against them, They had been really aggressive and had really had little to no resistance the last, 6 months going throughout Southeast Asia once they had attacked us in Pearl Harbor. So there were two major battles in June 1942. There was the Battle of Midway, okay, which is more in the middle of the Pacific, and then there was the Battle of the Coral Sea, which is right off the coast of Australia. And in both of these cases, Japan, for the very first time, was put on the defensive. They were not victorious. They were actually pushed back. And so this was shocking for them. And that was because of the collective effort of mostly the U.S., but also the Australian allied forces, in those regions, both with, similar interests. We wanted revenge for what they had done to us, and we didn't want to see them gather more. And obviously, Australia doesn't want Japan invading. So even though we are focused on the war in Europe and aiding our allies there, okay, we definitely on the side, it's kind of like you put most of your money into one investment, but on the side you're stashing kind of money away. You know, we're stashing resources and it's particularly our naval efforts into the Pacific because we wanted revenge, and this was personal for us. So where's the Coral Sea? So where's the Coral Sea? The Coral Sea, as you can see, if you look at this map of Australia, okay, is right off the right-hand coast, and you can see it labeled there, okay? So literally Japan was knocking on their doorstep, okay, was ready to invade and was planning an invasion of Australia. So our timing of arrival there couldn't have been better as far as coming together in that joint task force, you know, with the Australian troops to start pushing back and putting Japan on the offensive. Now, looking at the geography of Southeast Asia, this is a very different military obstacle to overcome than Europe. Europe, you have your typical ground invasion, right? You know, invasion, and you collect on all sides and you go in. The problem with Southeast Asia, what makes it so difficult, is it's a series of islands. So just because you take one doesn't really mean anything in the scope of everything else. And so the Allied powers, particularly the United States, are going to have to approach this very differently. You know, how in the world do you take all these different islands, thousands of islands potentially, hundreds of islands that the Japanese are occupying? And how do you even begin to, to undertake this without losing so many men? So this is going to be a real strategic obstacle that no one has ever really faced before, because we all know that the land to sea invasion, the casualty rates are high, and we didn't have those to spare because we were fighting the war in Europe. So this is going to be a very slow, painstaking process to undertake. So what is the strategy? How do you take on all these different islands, okay? And so they're going to use a strategy called island hopping, okay? So what they're going to basically do is, let's say, for instance, that the Japanese, let's say there's a series of 10 islands, and let's say that the Japanese are occupying 2 of them. It's not uncommon, if you've ever been to the Philippines or Indonesia or some of these island nations and stuff, there's actually a lot of islands that are not occupied, okay? So some of the major islands are occupied, but, you know, they could have hundreds or, you know, over 1,000 islands, but that doesn't mean all of them are occupied. So what the Allied forces decide to do is, instead of invade, what they do is, if let's say there's a series of 10 islands and 2 of the major islands are occupied by the Japanese, let's say, okay? And usually I would have drawn an analogy on the board, one of my amazing artistic, you know, drawings, and I know you guys miss so very much. So it's okay to laugh at that. I know I'm not artistic. It's okay. But it does give a visual to it, so I'm going to do my best to describe it. So you got a series of 10 islands, 2 are occupied by the Japanese. So what you do is you actually don't invade those 2 major islands, because your casualties will be super high and the Japanese will be ready for you. So here's what you do. You occupy surrounding islands that they don't occupy, and then you cut off their resources, okay? So you surround them so they can't have any resources, and you basically bleed them out. You starve them out, and then you bomb them. So you bomb them. So by having close by islands, then airplanes can take off and land, or having aircraft carriers close by, they can take off and land, okay? Because that was the strategic part, is having, you know, airplanes are effective, but they have to have a refueling base. So aircraft carriers really are the game changer. So if the #1 weapon of World War I was the machine gun, the #1 weapon of World War II in the war in the Pacific, not in Europe, but the war in the Pacific, was definitely aircraft carriers, because it's a mobile airport. So think about now, strategically, what advantage this gives you of getting close to your enemy and being able to bomb them effectively. If you're having to travel 200 miles, maybe you could do a couple passes and you got to travel back, it's really ineffective, where you could get these aircraft carriers pretty close. So they can bomb them for quite a while, come back, refuel, go back and do it again. So it really gives you a mobility. So aircraft carriers were really key to that. The other one, this island hopping strategy, was take less significant islands, surround the important islands that the Japanese occupy, basically bomb them and cut off their supplies, wait them out, and then when they give in, then you take it with little to no resistance, or at least not losing personnel. So it takes time, might take a month or 2 to get them to give in, but you're not losing all those men. So island hopping is kind of selectively picking strategic islands, surrounding, cutting off supplies, bombing them, and basically waiting them out, bleeding them out, so to speak, starving them out, however you want to see it. And then once they give in, then you occupy that, and you slowly just move up, you know, slowly but surely. So this went on from 1942 to 1944. And by 1944, we had taken back the Philippines and we were closing in on the mainland of Japan. So this was a 2-year process, painstakingly, of starting there near, in Indonesia, just off the coast of Australia, and then slowly moving up and strategically just taking back. And so it was a very slow process. So we were doing this while we were also fighting the war in Europe. So by 1944, we are close to the mainland of Japan. So as the war in Europe is ending in the spring 1945, basically the war in the Pacific is not done, but it's pretty far along. And now with one final force, they're ready to end it. They aren't just starting this island hopping. So we were in a lot of ways fighting a two-front war. We had our naval resources in the Pacific, and then we had our ground troops and our air force, or a good chunk of it, in Europe. So we really were kind of fighting a two-front war, but we were able to do that because we had the Soviet Union and the British, also, and the French filling in the gap in Europe. And again, for us personally, Southeast Asia was a bigger risk or threat by far.
From that point forward, the United States was on the offensive. General MacArthur devised the strategy of island hopping to fight the Japanese in the Pacific. The U.S. would island hop past Japan's heavily defended islands and seize the more easily defeated outposts. There, the United States could build landing strips and employ air power to cut Japan's supply lines. By August 1944, the U.S. was island hopping steadily toward Japan, capturing Guadalcanal, Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. By October, the U.S. Navy reached the Philippines. In the Battle of Leyte Gulf, they fought the Japanese fleet in one of the greatest naval operations in history. The U.S. prevailed. General MacArthur had kept his promise to return.
So what's important to note is, remember that the Japanese, while they advertised themselves as liberators in 1941, 1942, actually were really devastating to a lot of Southeast Asia. I mean, killings and rapings and pillagings. And so having the U.S. come was honestly a welcome sight for a lot of Southeast Asia, because the oppression of the Japanese was really something else. So 1945, like I said, April 1945, Allied troops meet in Germany. Hitler's committed suicide. VE Day, Victory in Europe Day, is May 7th, 1945. Also during this time, in April 1945, FDR, President Roosevelt of the United States, died of a stroke. So literally at the pinnacle, things are wrapping up, the war in Europe, our president dies. So think about just how unsettling that would be, just such a scary time, such a pivotal time in history, the biggest war we've ever been involved in anyone's history, and our leader dies. So Vice President Harry Truman is sworn in as president in April 1945. So I can only imagine, I want to take a second and try to imagine what this man was going through. Now, every president, vice president has, a different relationship. Some are known to really work well together. Some aren't. George W. Bush, Dick Cheney were known to work pretty well together, at certain points in their presidency. Joe Biden and President Obama were known to work really well together. There are many times in President Obama's presidency where Joe Biden would maybe say things he wasn't supposed to say ahead of time, but they had a pretty good working relationship. Our current president, Mike Pence and President Trump are not necessarily known for. President Trump kind of, gives Mike Pence specific tasks to do, but doesn't involve him in a lot of things. He really likes to kind of take charge. So it's really up to every president how much they use or don't use their vice president. So in this case, FDR was a very hands-on president, and he and Harry Truman actually were not known to get along that well. Harry Truman was kind of sent on the parade assignment, so to speak, go shake the hands, kiss the babies, but not really deeply involved in matters of war. Roosevelt really kept him out of a lot of that. And I don't know, to what extent that was just they didn't like each other, or maybe he was just kind of a control freak, but that was the case. So when Harry Truman was sworn in, it wasn't just, okay, I'm taking over. In a lot of cases, he's finding out things for the very first time. So here's an example, okay? The story goes is that he was out on the White House lawn, or, having tea, kind of, the day or whatever. The war in Europe has wrapped up. They're closing in on Japan. By summer of 1945, Japan is surrounded. So at this point, it's the last stand, okay? They've taken back Southeast Asia, and now it's the final offensive of how do we end this war? How do we get Japan to surrender? But again, pretty much all of the Axis powers had the same attitude. Stalin, when he was with them, Italy, till Mussolini was killed, Hitler, till he committed suicide, Japan the same way. It didn't matter that the writing was on the wall. It didn't matter that they were defeated. It didn't matter how much their advisor says, it's over, we need to give in. The pride of their leadership wouldn't. And we knew that. So summer 1945, Harry Truman now is a new president. He's got to wrap this up, and he's got to make some decisions. So the question becomes, do we invade or do we bomb Japan? Now, if we were to do a ground invasion, it was estimated that just the U.S. would lose about 250,000 troops. That's not counting the Japanese side. That's not counting how many civilians or anything like that. 250,000 U.S. lives and troops. Now, we have been in the war since end of 1941, beginning of 1942. So we were exhausted. It wasn't like World War I where we went in and it was no big deal. We were exhausted. And so when President Truman is trying to decide what do we do, he is presented with an envelope and says, well, there's another option. And it's labeled Manhattan Project. So I know you're probably thinking, I probably would be thinking, man, why are we talking about New York? We're talking about trying to get Japan to surrender here and 250,000 potential American lives that could be dead. Why are you handing me an envelope that says Manhattan Project? And somebody saying, no, just open it. And this was really known as the best kept secret of World War II. Even Harry Truman, as vice president, had no idea that this was going on. This really was the best kept secret of World War II. So he opens up this envelope and he finds out about this bomb that in secret for several years the U.S. has been developing in total secret, and now it's ready for testing. Okay, and this is not just any bomb. This is a bomb like the world has never seen. This is a bomb that is, in theory, is supposed to be able to take out, a small to medium-sized town, 50 to 100,000 people. Now, the components to make these bombs are very rare, so we only have 3. Can you imagine the shock you would have? You're like, what? We've been building what? And even more interesting is that the Nazis were building the same bomb, and they were actually further ahead than us. If we hadn't ended the war when we did, they probably would have completed their bomb before us. And if they had chosen to use it, World War II could have been a very different outcome. Very different outcome. I can't stress that enough. So it was really interesting that when the Allied powers conquered in Germany, the U.S. forces got to the German scientists before the Soviets. Because if the Soviets had got them, they wouldn't have shared them with us. Because remember, we were only working together because of Hitler. We did not like each other. And so we captured these Nazi scientists, took them to the U.S., okay, to New Mexico to work on this project. And because of their technology, because they were further than us, help us finish the bomb before the Soviets could get ahead of it. So this really was like, if we had not ended the war in Europe when we did, or gotten a hold of these scientists, very well easily could have been that the Nazis had finished them first, and if they had used them, which I have no reason to think they wouldn't have, a very different outcome of the war, super different outcome of the war. So they did their first test in July 1945. It was successful. They only had 3, so they couldn't test all of them, otherwise there wouldn't be any left. And President Truman then had to make a decision. Do we drop a bomb unlike anything the world has ever seen? Now, when you drop these bombs, this is such a big bomb. You don't just drop this on an Air Force, or you don't just drop this on a, a naval yard. It's too big for that. You have to have an impact, and so you have to drop it. Unfortunately, when you want to, if you want to maximize its use to justify using it, you drop it on a civilian location. And this was then the big moral dilemma, because when you think of rules of war, killing someone, think about it, in day-to-day life, if you kill somebody, you're put on trial. But in war, that's a part of war, right? And unfortunately, even civilian casualties are a part of war. Now, you're supposed to not go after, women and children. People do, but people aren't held accountable in the same way. Still, the idea of specifically targeting a civilian site is kind of going outside the rules or the customs of war, right? And so Harry Truman had to make a decision. Are we going to bomb civilian, innocent Japanese people who, just like us, are probably desperate for the war to end, just want this to be done, have lost family, want their loved ones back, want their emperor, they just want this to be done. They are only doing what their country is telling them to do. Do we bomb them, or do we risk killing 250,000 of our troops, not even mentioning how many Japanese troops would die? And so Harry Truman had to make a real moral decision, whose lives were more valuable. And still to this day, it's a controversial decision. So he issued a warning to Japan saying surrender or face utter and complete destruction. There was absolutely no response from Japan, so he made the decision. On August 6, 1945, the first atomic bomb was dropped on the city of Hiroshima. It flattened 4 square miles. The initial blast killed at least 70,000 people. It was even more effective than people were expecting. And even, thousands more, they say tens of thousands more killed later from the radiation sickness and the burns. What response did we get? Nothing. We heard nothing from Japan. So Truman again said, you need to surrender. Silence from Japan, no response. And he said, a rain of ruin from the air, the likes of which has never been seen before. And this is true. To have one bomb that could absolutely decimate, this picture down here shows you some of the destruction, that could absolutely decimate a city, had never been used before. And it still to this day is very controversial. Did we have the right to use such a weapon? When you go to war, I'm not saying it's okay that men die, but that's what you sign up for, and that's the cost of it. But by targeting civilians, did we go too far? Did we violate a moral compass that that we didn't have a right to do? And still to this day, people hold it against us. People feel that we went too far, and I don't know that there's a right answer to that. I really think it comes down to he had to make a decision, and at that point of the war, 3 years into the war, he didn't want to risk any more U.S. lives because the Japanese were being so stubborn and had demonstrated that by no response, the same way that Hitler was, that to the bitter end, this could have gone on for another 6 months, a year even. 2 days after we dropped the bomb, the Soviet Union officially declares war on Japan because the war in Europe is wrapped up. So they have now brought in reinforcements and are ready to aid us in wrapping up this war. We sent the ultimatum to Japan, no response. So 3 days after the first one, we dropped a second bomb on August 9th, 1945 on the city of Nagasaki. Now, this bomb was not as effective as the first one. The first one was a true epicenter hit. It did the maximum damage it could do. This one, I guess that the weather was a little off that day and cloudy, and so when they dropped the bomb, the coordinates were a little bit off and they hit just off center, so it didn't do the full destruction. It still did a ton of destruction, do not get me wrong, I'm not trying to say it wasn't destructive at all, but it wasn't quite the magnitude that the other one was. Okay, so they estimate that about 40,000 people died from this, and again tens of thousands more from the radiation and the burns. And finally, the next day, on August 10th, Emperor Hirohito officially surrendered. The dropping of these two bombs is the only time in history that an atomic bomb has been used in warfare, and truly seeing the destruction of this and knowing, I mean, this was what, 70 years ago, 80 years ago almost. We would hate to see something like this happen again, because the weapons are now all the more destructive and would just absolutely be devastating. So we're going to watch a quick video on this next slide, just about the effects. And this is some of the only footage we have. And the music is hokey, so please forgive that. But I think it gives you an opportunity to see a lot of these people that you're going to see in the video died later, but it's a good opportunity to see the effects.
This is something more than the fifth atomic bomb. This seething maelstrom of millions of tons of water pictures the dilemma of our age. With the wonders of scientific achievement before us, the choice is justice and peace, or this kind of atomic death. There is no alternative. For the second test at Bikini, this was the plan. Exploded 20 to 40 feet below the surface of the sea, a huge mass of water is forced upwards and outwards. A gigantic eruption spraying radioactive matter for miles. A little over a year ago, as these captured Japanese films show, the first atomic bomb on Hiroshima killed, burned and maimed 194,000 people. How many more died later from deadly rays and mysterious after effects will never be known. Fabric like this was used in a woman's dress. When the bomb fell, heat branded the pattern into her flesh. All films made by Japanese official cameramen have now been confiscated. Military and medical experts will study them for the effects of the bomb. Heat, indescribably intense, traced the outline of a man's body on the concrete roads, a permanent memorial to the first use of the world's most powerful weapon. These pictures provide the true background to the deliberations of the Allied peacemakers in Paris. Their impact on our minds is itself a shock and a warning. This man is alive, but he was later to die with many thousands of others from the effects of gamma rays. All this is what one bomb did at Hiroshima. The scientists and soldiers know it. Yet till the world can be sure of peace, they also know that they must perfect the bomb. And this they have done at Bikini.
Okay, so this video just gave you at least a brief glimpse of, I mean, you see that, people died immediately from the bomb, and you saw that one outline of the man where literally his shadow was burnt into the concrete, I mean, to tell you, and this is there was no remains left. It literally incinerated your body, and having, burn marks of the patterns of your fabric on you or your watch and stuff. And so many people died again later from excruciating injuries and radiation and, exposure and cancer and other illnesses caused by the exposure from the atomic bomb. So even though the surrender was in August 1945, the official peace treaty was signed September 2nd, 1945. So you have VE Day, May 7th, 1945, but the official end of the war with Japan surrender, the last Axis power, is going to be September 2nd, 1945. So why did we drop the bomb? Why did we justify it? And I hope that you will, this is always a touchy subject and I completely understand it. Why did we drop the bomb? There's no perfect answer. I see both sides of this. So this is where you have to use kind of SOAP perspective. You have to use kind of point of view. So why did we drop the bomb? Well, Japan wouldn't surrender. They had proven that. They had shown that they were surrounded. They had showed they wouldn't even respond. And they had very much the mentality of the Italians waiting till Mussolini died to switch sides, Hitler to the bitter end. So we knew this could go on for another 6 months, a year. The invasion was going to be enormously costly for us, and so selfishly, the U.S. politicians felt like we shouldn't have to risk lives because they are stubborn, because they don't see the writing on the wall. It's not fair. And this was another thing. As the war is wrapping up, the alliances are falling apart, right? Once Hitler's done, there's really, the alliance, especially between Britain, U.S., and the Soviets. The Soviets, remember that hatred for communism comes right back up to the surface, and so, they came together for the common cause, and once the common cause was done, they're right back to the old rift. And so this was impressive. People still today hold it against us and say that we went too far, and there's an argument for that they can make. That it's hypocritical when we say other countries shouldn't have nuclear weapons when we're the only ones in history to use an atomic weapon, and then what eventually will morph into nuclear weapons. We impressed the Soviet Union. This was kind of this goes right back to, and really what happens is right after World War II, we go right into the Cold War, which is not an official front war, but it's a war between communism and anti-communism, right? Democratic countries, really, and it starts as democracy versus communism, but really what it turns into is communists and then anyone else, anyone else can join the other team. And so this was impressive. This was flexing the muscles. Whether or not it was justified, that will always be a point of view perspective. Obviously, from the Japanese point of view, this was going too far. We targeted civilians, and that was wrong. From the American point of view, well, it wasn't fair that we should have to risk another 250,000 American lives. So this really becomes a point of view where it's hard to know. It really depends on your perspective of it, whether or not we made the right decision.
On September 2, 1945, Japan formally surrendered aboard the U.S. battleship Missouri in Tokyo Bay.
The Supreme Commander of the Allied Powers will now sign on behalf of all the nations at war with Japan.
The war was finally over, and the world celebrated.
Okay, so this is a really good slide to make sure that you don't skip over, okay? Because this kind of really sums it up, okay? So the aftermath of the war. The estimated death toll from World War I, anybody remember? Think about it for a second. 8 to 10 million, okay? 8 to 10 million total. The aftermath of World War II, 75 million people. 75 million people. Now, a lot of those soldiers, but tons of those civilians, and things like the internment camps, the horrors of the Holocaust come to light. So you have to understand, 1945 just would have been a crazy year to be alive. Can you imagine being a teenager, being our age, your age, not my age, your age, 1945? You have the end of the war in Europe, Hitler, the most evil man in the world, the scene, finally coming down. You have the horrors of the Holocaust coming out and hearing about 12 million people, 6 million of those Jews, and the way that they were systematically killed. Then you have the dropping of not one, but 2 atomic bombs. So first you learn of an atomic bomb, a bomb that the world has never seen, and then the devastation of it and the end of the war. I mean, Holy cow, I bet that was a year where people were just like, oh my gosh, I need some therapy, because this is like, wow, blowing your mind, the evils of mankind on all sides, the death toll. It would just be absolutely devastating. Germany is just going to be in shambles and after the war. And this is a really big precedent. This is the first time we see wartime trials. You have to understand, like I said in a previous slide, it used to be that, killing during war was different than during peace times. And so almost kind of like anything goes during times of war, and you weren't held accountable for it after the war. And the Allied powers are going to feel that this is not okay. They had to be held accountable for the concentration camps and the genocide of the Jews and all these other groups that they systematically killed. And so for the first time, you see acts of war being held in a civil criminal court, outside of war. And that had never really been done before. The idea, that there is a line, and if you cross that line, even in times of war, that you will be held accountable. And so that was a really big deal because it had never been done before. And part of the reason they were able to do that is because there was so much evidence. Like I said before, people wonder, why do we talk more about the Holocaust and say other genocides like the Armenian genocides or the Darfur genocides or things like that? The documentation is just overwhelming. So the amount of documentation they had, evidence, so to speak, made it irrefutable in the eyes of the law that they could actually prosecute it. So that was a really big deal that we haven't really seen before. Now, nobody was looking to kick the dog while it was down this time. Remember, Treaty of Versailles was about punishing Germany. And fortunately, on this front, the Allied powers had learned their lesson, okay? We can't just punish them again because look what happened. They went into oppression, and we had a Hitler, and oh my goodness, So here's what they did. They divided up Germany into 4 quadrants, okay? So there, if you look at Germany, okay, you divide it up into 4. So the Soviet Union got one section, Britain got one section, U.S. got one section, and France got one section. Now you're going to go, why would they divide it up into 4? Well, Soviet Union wasn't about to let the democratic countries of France, Britain, and U.S. have control. Britain and France wasn't about to allow the Soviet Union to have control because they were communists. Communists didn't want to see democratic societies have that. U.S. felt entitled, like, well, look what happened last time with the Treaty of Versailles, and we gave you guys control, and you mucked that up. So U.S. wasn't allowed or didn't trust Britain, France, and of course not the Soviet Union. All 3 of them agreed not to trust the Soviet Union. So everyone had their own selfish reasons for wanting their own quadrant and overseeing that. Now, each person or each group was supposed to have access to the other quadrant, but their goal was to oversee the rebuilding of factories, setting up the governments, getting people back to work, okay? And then we, of course, we occupied Japan. And when we did that, we did a similar version of Treaty of Versailles, in that we destroyed their air force, their navy, like we militarily demilitarized them, okay, stripped them of that. But what we decided to do, so we didn't create another Germany 2.0 as far as that revenge and coming back, was we tried to help them rebuild economically. And this actually was very successful. Japan today is a powerhouse economically, and was for the second half of the 20th century, 1950s, 60s, 70s, in manufacturing and trade. They have been a huge economic presence, and that is partially due to the occupation of the U.S. helping them rebuild their economy. So militarily, we destroyed them, but economically helping oversee that rebuilding so that we didn't, again, have another 2.0 version of that revenge and extremism that led to this past war. The United Nations was another big movement. Now, after World War I, we talked about the League of Nations a little bit. So the League of Nations, which was put together by the United States, was an attempt to bring nations together, a negotiation table, so to speak, right, where you take problems and kind of like in a court of law, and it's a way to figure it out without going to war. So that didn't work, though, because with the policies of appeasement, when Japan invaded Manchuria, when Italy invaded Ethiopia, basically all they could do is send threatening letters. They couldn't do anything. They had no force to back it up. They had no military. They had no money. And so they really were ineffective and crumbled. So the United Nations is like the League of Nations 2.0. Okay, so it's a second attempt to build this. And so does anybody know where the United Nations meets now? So they originally met in San Francisco, but now they meet, anybody? New York, right? Yeah, okay. So they meet all around the world, but that's one of their main meeting places. So it's broken up into And today there are several hundred countries that are part. So it started with 50 countries, 50 nations that were a part of this, and then over time, many, many nations, and well over, I think we're getting close to 200 nations now that are in the United Nations. So it's grown, significantly over time. But it started with 50 nations, and now they meet in New York City, but originally met in San Francisco. So it's made up of a two-party system, or two groups. So here's what it is. You have the General Assembly, where every single country, despite size, influence, whatever, gets one vote. So if there's an issue or a problem, so let's say it's a recent one, maybe the issues in Syria. Syria's been going through a lot of trouble. So the question was, should we intervene? And so they hold a vote, majority rules, okay? And every country, despite your size, gets a vote. So let's say that there was the issue in Syria of, should the United Nations intervene in this civil war that they're having? And originally the vote was yes, that they should intervene. So then it goes to the Security Council, okay? So it's past the first level. Now it has to go to the Security Council. So the Security Council is a sub-council, small council of 5 kind of powerhouse members, okay? Plus 2 rotating. So it's 5 permanent and then 2 temporary that rotate from the General Assembly. And again, so it could pass the General Assembly, but if it doesn't pass the Security Council, then it goes back to the General Assembly. So it basically is dead in the water, okay? So the 5 permanent members, here's who they are, okay? So United States, Soviet Union, which is now Russia, Britain, France, and China. Okay, and so depending on the issue, sometimes there's unification, but oftentimes anyone can veto basically a council's decision. So for example, when it was agreed upon by the General Assembly to go in and aid in the Syrian civil war, to bring some stability, to work with the government and maybe even get rid of their leadership, it went to the Security Council and everyone voted yes, even China voted yes, that we should go in. And there was one country that said no, Russia. Why? Because they have an alliance with Syria, because they sell weapons to Syria. So for overtoppling the government would be bad for business. Here's another example, North Korea. North Korea is a squeaky wheel, right? There's always a problem. There's always an issue. They're always a threat. They're like the tantrum throwing 2-year-old. People don't really take them seriously, but you have to in that, they can cause problems, but in most cases, it's kind of a nuisance. And anytime North Korea needs something, that's when they start testing bombs and stuff, because it's a negotiation power to get, leverage over people. So what do we do? The issue goes to the General Assembly. The General Assembly almost always votes to punish North Korea when they act out, when they violate, agreements that they have. It goes to the Security Council. Everybody wants North Korea put in their place, but who always votes no? China. Why? Because it's their close neighbor and their allies, and China sells a lot of resources and things to North Korea. So don't get me wrong, the United Nations is an amazing resource to come together, to discuss, to diplomatically address, international issues and concerns, but often is ineffective in actually taking action because of this Security Council and the power then that one of these major nations can have in flexing to veto. And those are just a couple of examples of that. So after the war, almost immediately, there is going to be a return to the previous tensions of communism versus anti-communism, okay? And Winston Churchill coined it best. He called it an iron curtain. He said that basically an iron curtain has dropped across the continent of Eurasia, okay, between communism and anti-communism. And what's happening is after World War II, decolonization is happening. That's what we're going to talk about in Chapter 32. So Chapter 32 is decolonization, and Chapter 33 is the Cold War. And so what he's talking about is as decolonizations happen, here's what everybody realizes. Everybody kind of has a new respect for humankind after World War II. I think it jarred everybody that no one has the right to be controlled by somebody else. Because how's any different? How is Germany trying to conquer Eastern Europe or France any different than Britain colonizing in Southeast Asia or us colonizing, somewhere else? And people finally realize, oh, it isn't any different, and if we're saying that they don't have the right to do it, then we don't. We're being hypocritical. So decolonization is going to be a huge movement in the late 40s and the 50s. As each nation is gaining its independence, it has to choose a type of government. And so what happens is that countries start to step in to try to bribe or incentivize countries to become communist or anti-communist. Well, how do you incentivize? You offer money. So Stalin is going to put huge pressure on Eastern Europe and those countries to join the Soviet Union and protection and the benefits of those. Plus, in a lot of cases, they didn't have a choice. They were such small, poor countries that just for survival they had to. And the US and other countries are going to go around and again offer military aid and money to basically for countries to sign an agreement that they would be anything except communist. Like, I don't care what kind of government, I don't care if you're a dictatorship, you just can't be communist. And so this iron curtain that is going to divide the world will ascend very quickly in the 40s and early 50s. Actually, we're going to skip that video. So we're just going to get to it. Okay. So the U.S. is going to adopt a policy of containment, okay? We knew we couldn't take out communism. If we did that, we would have World War III, and nobody was ready for that. And now with atomic weapons and developing into nuclear weapons, and the Soviet Union wasn't far behind us. Within a year, they had their own weapon. We knew that if we had a third World War, the death toll would be, I mean, World War II would look like nothing. You know, if you have bombs that can kill 100,000 people in one drop, I mean, you can see how quickly the death rate would just be in crazy. Plus, everyone is just exhausted. So we knew that we couldn't end communism. We knew that, okay, without going to a third World War, which wasn't even an option. So our goal was to contain it, you know, to put up a fence and just keep it from spreading. Kind of like what we're doing in a different way, but in a similar way with the coronavirus, right? You know we can't eradicate it, but we're trying to contain it with social distancing, right? By taking measures to help it stop spread, at least it won't get worse. You know, to help it from spreading, it won't get worse. So in the same way, we saw communism as like this disease that was spreading through countries and our economies, and we would do anything to contain it. So the Truman Doctrine was to do anything we could to, okay, the Soviets are, you know, communist, and Eastern Europe, because of the cultural connection and geography, are going to be communist, but we want to keep it from going anywhere closer to that. So for instance, like we went into Turkey, into Greece, and Italy, and we offered a lot of money and things like that to keep these people from that. So the Truman Doctrine was enacted through the Marshall Plan. So the Marshall Plan was passed by our Congress and Senate, okay, that we would give aid. So massive aid program to Europe. So food, economic systems to help Europe rebuild. And then we extended this into even parts of Asia, the Middle East and Africa with decolonization, incentivizing countries to join, at least to not go communist, okay, because people needed help. It's kind of like you get out there in the big bad world and you got to pick a side, or you're going to be eaten alive. You know what I mean? And so everybody had to pick a side. And so each side is trying to incentivize or buy off the other side. And this truly is what leads into the Cold War, which is communism versus anti-communism. And this is going to build itself up into military alliances, okay? So there will be two sides, the communist side and the anti-communist side. So the anti-communist side will be the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO, okay, which is still in existence today. So in 1949, this was developed, which was that countries that were anti-communist would agree to basically free trade or incentivized trade. So sometimes it's been free trade or easier trade restrictions to economically work together and have a military alliance. Well, of course, the communists are sitting around, oh, not fair. They have a club. We want our own club. So they're going to develop their own club, military club, or military alliance, the Warsaw Pact in 1955. And so when we go from World War II, we really go back to that communist. So think back all the way to World War I, 1919, you know, the Red Scare. This has been going on for a while. It just formalizes itself into NATO and the Warsaw Pact. And we're going to continue now the arms race, the military race. It's no longer about guns and ships and things like that. Now it's about nuclear weapons. It's who has the biggest or who has the most. And actually this hits home for us because just north of us, right, just north of Nellis Air Force Base was one of the main nuclear testing sites for decades. That was part of what developed Las Vegas, you know, its early city, and people would work up there working for the federal government testing bombs. The man that I did was my mentor teacher at Palo Verde High School. He was in his 60s when I did my student teaching with him, and he talked about growing up and going to high school here, how they would have literally drills where a big alarm would go off and they would have to get in shelter in place, get under their desks because they would be doing a nuclear test, and it would shake the ground and it would feel like an earthquake, you know, and that's a reality here, testing those nuclear weapons in that arms race during the Cold War. Okay, so this wraps up World War II. I hope that you can kind of chronologically see what's happened. Germany again was at the epicenter of this war, and again the strategy was to end the war with, you know, Hitler first and then end the war in Japan, somewhat avoiding a two-front war, even though we kind of fought a two-front war. And again, hoping, seeing weapons like we've never seen before, and a lot of controversy from it. You know, the Holocaust and genocide and holding people accountable for that. That was a really big deal. The dropping of the 2 atomic bombs, still historically very controversial. And the death toll just like nothing we've ever seen. So we're going to wrap it up at that, and hope you have a good rest of the day.